Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan, and good morning everyone. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin, wassalatu wassalamu ala asrofil anbiya'i wal mursalin, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi rasulillahi ajmain, amma ba'du. The Honorable Dr. Ani Susanti MPDBI as the Head of English Education Department, the Honorable Dr. Peter Crosswhite, today's guest lecturer from University of Queensland, Australia, the Honorable Dr. Ikmi Nur Oktavianti as the moderator of today's webinar, the Honorable all of the lecturer of English Education Department, and the respectable all of the participants and committees. First of all, let's say thanks to our God, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, the Lord of the universe, who has been giving us His blessings and mercy so that we can gather in this webinar. Second of all, may peace be upon our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who has guided us into the right ways of life. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Aisyah Haril Surya. As Master of Ceremony, I would like to say welcome to the International Webinar Series of English Education Department with the theme Corpora and Data-Driven Learning, Insight from the Indonesian Context. Before starting our agenda, let me explain the agenda schedule of this webinar. First opening, second main agenda, third Q&A session, and the last is closing. The first agenda is opening. Let's open our event today by reciting Basmalah together. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The next agenda is the main agenda, which we are waiting for explanation from our guest lecturer, Dr. Peter. Before that, let me introduce Mrs. Ikmi as our moderator for today's webinar. Mrs. Ikmi is one of the lecturers in the English Education Department since 2012 onwards. Mrs. Ikmi has completed her studies and received a doctorate from Universitas Gajah Mada. Mrs. Ikmi is research interest in the fields of syntax, linguistic, typology, and the corpus for English language teaching and learning. We can also see the titles of the latest publication from Mrs. Ikmi on the screen. So, for Mrs. Ikmi, time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Aisyah, for introducing me. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, good morning, everyone. Today we are going to have the guest lecture, with Dr. Peter Crosswhite, our guest speaker from the University of Queensland. And he is going to talk about corpus use in English language teaching, known as data-driven learning. Before we go to the talk, we need to, I need to read his bio or his curriculum vitae. He is a senior lecturer in the School of Languages and Cultures at University of Queensland since 2017. And he holds an MA TESOL from the University of London and MPhil or PhD in Applied Linguistics from the University of Cambridge. And his areas of research and supervisory expertise include corpus linguistics and the use of Corpora for language learning, known as data-driven learning, as well as English for general and specific academic purposes. He has published in leading journals, including Language Learning, Corpus Linguistics and Linguistic Theory, Studies in Second Language Acquisition, and many others. And his previous work experience includes consultancies and editorial positions with publishers, including Cambridge University Press. And he is also the co-author on CUP's latest IELTS series, entitled Mindset for IELTS Level 1 and 2. And he is also currently serving as associate editor for the Q1 Index Corpus, entitled Journal of English for Academic Purposes, as well as on the editorial boards of IRAL, System and Applied Corpus Linguistics, a new journal covering the direct applications of Corpora to teaching and learning. So he has, reputable publications, as well as work experiences, in the field of English language teaching and corpus linguistics. Dr. Peter Crosswit, good afternoon.
Yes, well, it's good morning where you're at, isn't it? I think you're on just past 9:30. And yeah, I was just listening to the wonderful music coming in, and I felt like I was some kind of like
it's still morning here
or something like that. These are very well organized sessions, I can see. I think I could learn something from the way that you're organizing these lectures today. I'm sure that some of you, or perhaps many of you, might have come along to my own online seminar series that I run weekly. That's the International Perspectives on Corporate Language Learning series. I think I've seen some of the people here in this room also attend some of those. But certainly the organization of this guest lecture, I think, is in terms of the professionalism on display is really quite good. So very pleased to see that. And also this is not my first kind of interaction with Indonesian corpus linguistics and people interested in including corpora into their practice. So this is, I think, the fourth such experience now since the beginning of COVID. So it's good that there's clearly a lot of interest in this topic in the Indonesian context, and I'm happy to present again on this today.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Peter Crosswit. So we can start the talk right now.
Yes.
So I would like to invite Dr. Peter Crosswit to share his expertise on corpus use for language teaching. The floor is yours.
While you're there, can you also make me the co-host so that it's easier for me to share screen and things like that?
Okay. Maybe Mas Kiki, can you?
Should just be able to do it in the chat. I think I can share my screen now, but I'm not.
Help Dr. Peter Crosswit as the co-host.
I mean, it does seem to work. So maybe being the co-host doesn't matter that much. But as long as everybody can see my screen, then I think we'll be okay. How about that? Is that all right?
Yeah, I can see the screen.
Okay, good. Then in that case, let's begin. So as I understand with this workshop, I've got actually quite a bit of time. I think it was agreed like about 2 hours, a little bit more than that. So I decided to break up today's session into 4 different parts. The first part just provides an overview about the use of corpora and in education more generally, as well as its application for language learning, more specifically in the form of data-driven learning. We'll then have a very brief overview of a selection of some of my preferred corpus tools that I like to demonstrate with new teachers, new audiences, in order to allow you to understand a little bit about what these tools can do, and as well as a little bit about what they can't do, so that I guess the stage then is set for you to begin to think about how you might incorporate the use of some of these tools into your teaching practice. In the third part of the talk, I'll then present an overview of the results from 2 research papers that were published, one in 2021 in the new journal Applied Corpus Linguistics, which Ahmad did notice then at the end that I'm on the editorial board of this journal now, which is a new journal which looks at the uses of corpus linguistics for applied purposes, including education, second language learning, and so on. This was conducted with researchers at Ahmad University in Jakarta. It's part of their English teacher training practice there. And a second paper published in Computer-Assisted Language Learning, again focusing on that Ahmad intervention, and this time focusing specifically on the kind of lesson planning that the trainees were able to develop after a short period of training in corpus-based language teaching. The fourth and final part, if we get time, we'll explore some open educational resources containing ready-made lesson plans featuring corpus-based activities that you might want to have a look at and perhaps use or modify for use in your own classrooms for getting some of your students interested in corpus tools. And if you're working with language teachers or language teacher trainees, to allow them to see the process of integrating a corpus-based activity into a typical lesson plan. So let's begin with some initial questions about what essentially a corpus-based approach seeks to do. And that involves some questions that I might like to ask the audience. And don't feel like you need to answer, but just be answering these questions in the back of your mind as you go along. And we start over with the question here on my left, which is about, do we say a quick car or a fast car? Usually. And ordinarily, if I had a bit more time, I'd give a kind of like a slide or a poll or something like that in Zoom. But I believe that you will have already come up with your own opinion about which is the more likely possibility. Will it be a quick car or a fast car? And the second question to that is related to how you know which one is correct. You probably have an intuition, one way or another, about whether it's a quick car that is the appropriate expression, or whether it's a fast car that is the appropriate expression. And that intuition comes from somewhere. The intuition is based on some kind of implicit knowledge that you have related to the statistical likelihood of the adjective quick being together with car versus the statistical likelihood of the adjective fast being together with car. And what we're interested in then is how you acquired that knowledge as a learner of English. How did you get that knowledge? And how long did it take you to acquire that knowledge? Now, as a so-called native speaker of English, in that I grew up from day zero in an English-speaking environment, and I've been exposed to English every day of my life since birth, in the millions, billions of words. I acquired that knowledge without necessarily being taught it formally in a school or in a textbook. Rather, I acquired that knowledge naturalistically through exposure and through use. And essentially, within second language acquisition, learning and teaching theory, one of the most predominant theories now about how languages are learned is that of the usage-based approaches, which emphasize that what is used the most is learned the first. In other words, the frequency of the input and saliency of the combinations that are in construction will allow you to learn those faster and without necessarily learning them explicitly, i.e. through formal instruction. As second language learners, yes, there will be some implicit learning going on, but your exposure to the target language will be much less than that of mine, primarily because you'll be studying, teaching, and learning in an EFL context where the main languages that are spoken will be Indonesian, variants of Indonesian, and English will be seen as a foreign subject, a foreign language, and your exposure to that language will be much less, and therefore your knowledge of these kind of implicit relations between form and function and the statistical relations between language will be difficult to acquire. And these are one of the most common problems that second language learners have in speaking and writing, is knowing which words go together with other words and which grammatical structures are appropriate and which are not. Now, a key question then is, now that I've set the scene for usage-based approaches to second language learning and language acquisition, the importance of frequency and salience to understanding how language works, how can we speed up the process for second language learners in acquiring those same relationships that I've been acquiring over the course of my life? In other words, can this process be speeded up in some way by the use of technology? And it is here that we can now make the segue into the use of language corpora and the use of language corpora for the teaching and learning of both first and second languages. In my own research that is coming out, I think this week, actually, on a 20-year analysis of the research topics in the field of corpus linguistics, there are hundreds of topics that are being tackled by corpus linguists around the world and have been for the last 2 decades. These include studies on grammar, metaphor, semantics, spoken discourse, second language writing, and so on. As you can see over here, where my mouse is hovering, we have this term here also called DDL, or data-driven learning, i.e. the use of corpus linguistics for second language learning is now a prominent area of research in corpus linguistics as a whole, with over 450 published studies in this area in many journals around the world, according to a recent literature review by Alex Bolton and Nina Vakina that came out last year. But suffice to say that there is much interest in the use of corpora for educational purposes, and that interest is only increasing over time. So how do we use corpora in education? How do we use these large collections of electronically searchable text that constitute corpora within the field of TESOL, or second language acquisition? And it is actually the case that many of you will probably have been exposed to corpus data now for many years without necessarily realizing it. In that, corpus activities have now long featured in dictionary production. So for those of you who've ever used an English dictionary recently, there is a lot of corpus research that goes into the production of modern dictionaries. For example, the Longman Grammar of Spoken and Written English is a famous example. If you work in the language testing field, or you've taken a language test recently, the major language test and test preparation materials are produced with the use of corpora to help materials developers write textbooks, test items, model answers, and so on. In terms of curricula, numerous textbooks by all major publishers, including Cambridge, Oxford, Pearson, you name it, all use language corpora, and all hire corpus linguists in their publishing houses to help them understand some of the key errors that learners make at different levels of proficiency, the different vocabulary and grammar that is expected at different levels of proficiency, and they're able to structure syllabuses and textbook series according to that corpus findings. even in my own extensive experience producing IELTS textbooks for Cambridge University Press, I've also used numerous corpus tools and corpus resources to help design my activities and structure my my chapters in ways that use authentic language as you find in corpus data, and also to help me sequence the grammar and vocabulary according to proficiency, so that I can be sure that my textbook materials are meeting the requirements for people at that level and helping them cover all of the vocabulary and grammar that they might need to learn. However, what you can see here in the bottom right-hand corner of the image is what we call cutting out the middleman, which is a phrase that Alex Bolton has used to talk about corpora and data-driven learning. Or Tim Johns, back in 1991, used that expression to say, okay, well, if dictionary makers and textbook material designers are using language corpora, why can't we cut out those people and give language learners and teachers direct access to corpora for the purposes of teaching and learning? And he called that term data-driven learning. So that's what data-driven learning means. It giving teachers and learners access to corpus resources for the purposes of language learning and teaching. DDL, data-driven learning, we often shorten to the term DDL, involves direct learner engagement with language corpus data. This comes typically in the research in two forms. The first form is so-called hands-off DDL, where learners are given printed corpus materials in their classroom, and the teacher and students work together with those printed materials to learn about language through language and to look at a range of target features, including vocabulary, phraseology, collocation, grammar, discourse, whatever the purpose of the lesson is. More recently, however, as access to the internet and access to corpus resources and corpus tools have moved online and are increasingly accessible, we see a lot more in what's called hands-on DDL, which is where the learners and teachers themselves go into corpus data through the use of online corpus tools and consult the corpora themselves to arrive at conclusions about whatever it is that the students and teachers are trying to learn and teach that day. The idea behind it is that it allows learners to internalize statistical and contextual information about language in use in a similar way, but in a much quicker way than how native speakers of the language acquire that kind of statistical knowledge about the language that they're acquiring. We tend to consider students through the metaphor of language detectives, with every student a Sherlock Holmes, which is a commonly used phrase by Tim Johns back in 1997. How does it work? This image explains DDL at both the individual and at the classroom-based level. At the individual level, students' corpus consultation, mainly through the form of concordance lines, but increasingly through other statistical and visual information that the tools provide, allow for students to think for themselves and develop their own queries and manipulate the corpus data in their own ways to arrive at their own conclusions about what it is that they're looking for, and based on that to reflect on that. And it's that process of engaging with language data and reflecting on what they see, which is claimed to learn to language acquisition. In this case, increased knowledge of vocabulary and or syntax, discourse, or other language-related features. Outside of the individual level, teacher-guided activities and collaborative in-class DDL with teacher-supported activities and peer activities and scaffolding can lead to a more social-cultural way of acquiring the language and understanding corpus consultation and the corpus findings, which can also lead to successful second language acquisition if managed carefully. So combining that kind of individual learner-instigated, learner-directed corpus consultation with clever use of teacher scaffolding and peer support can lead and has been shown to lead to learning gains in a wide range of contexts and a wide range of target language features, including vocabulary, grammar, discourse, pragmatics, you name it. There's been plenty of studies on that to date. How does it work? When most people consult language corpora, they might have been, or for many of you in the room, if you've ever tried to use a corpus platform before, the most frequent thing that you will see is that of concordance lines, where you will type in a query, in this case for the word results, and then you will be given hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of the word results with some context to the left or right of that term. And the idea is that through exposure to these lines and by seeing the search term in context, they are both explicitly reading these lines and learning about the term in that way, and they're also implicitly, without realizing it, taking into account a lot of other statistical information about that word in context, including which words come to the left, which words come to the right, which words don't appear, which words do appear together with that word that they've searched for. In the same way that extended reading will do, but with extended reading, you might experience that word once in maybe 30 pages. With corpus consultation, you will experience that word many hundreds of times at the touch of a button. Increasingly, however, as the corpus tools have improved in functionality, we are now able to see things like three-word combinations or so-called n-grams, together with information about their frequency and their relative occurrence within a given corpus, with the idea being that the more frequent a term is, the more used it is, and therefore this is the term that you should be learning. Vice versa, by comparing the relative frequencies of words in different slots. For example, here we've got an expression using the term death penalty with a verb preceded by any verb, and I can get here some information about which verbs are found, and the idea being that the most frequent one might be the most likely candidate for the student to be using in that slot. The most recent and best corpus tools even present visual information in this way, which can make it more accessible to learners who want to understand the patterns of language without necessarily having to read lots of text, which might be overwhelming for some students. By combining these different kinds of data, both visual and text and numerical, students are exposed to the inner workings of how language is put together and produced. And so the story goes, exposure to this is meant to be very useful for language learning across a range of contexts. The idea is that DDL promotes autonomous and constructivist learning practices within its students. By constructivist, we mean that learners take in multiple sources of information to arrive at conclusions. By autonomous, we mean that learners learn best when they discover or can be led to discover themselves. And through, as I already mentioned, that kind of inductive learning without necessarily understanding or without paying attention to specific language features, but by noticing them implicitly and by combining inductive learning with deductive reasoning, the kind of typical classroom activities that you might begin with. By combining both kinds of learning in this way, the learners are doing all that they can within a classroom setting, given the limited time that is available, to understand as much about language as is possible. So that's a little bit about what DDL is. And I hope that has given you an overview as to what it is, why we might want to do it, and what some of the advantages are in adopting a corpus-based approach into some of your classroom practice. Now, to problematize that a little bit, for many of you might already be familiar with Corpora or data-driven learning, but many of you might not be. And the reason for that is because of some of the reasons that you can see here on the slide. In that, while we've come a long way in the last 20 years and there is now a lot of published research on Corpora and DDL out there, we still have a general lack of information, say, on the training that's provided in the use of corpus tools and integration of DDL in classroom practice. Very often, it is people like myself, as applied linguists, who are leading and kind of pushing teachers to adopt this approach, rather than teachers themselves trying to lead and push this approach within their own classroom practice or within the classroom practice of their peers or their local education systems. And like most studies on computer-assisted language learning generally, most DDL studies have been conducted at the university level and also primarily in Western educational contexts like Australia, Europe, and the United States. That means for it to work, we need much more research and teaching practice within other contexts. In particular, there isn't much research yet, although this number is increasing, on the use of DDL in primary school settings and secondary school settings. Because as I mentioned, most studies to date have been conducted at the university level. Therefore, there is a lack of knowledge about DDL by secondary school teachers and a lack of understanding about how it can help them and what it can do. My own research and that of some notable other colleagues in the field have shown a number of barriers that are still in the way when it comes to implementing and integrating DDL into primary and secondary classrooms. 3 of these are listed here. The first is a lack of materials, corpus materials and DDL tools that are specifically designed for younger learners, children, teachers, non-experts, because most of the Corpora and tools were developed with university level students and researchers in mind. There is a lack of software available specific for use with younger learners. And most importantly for language teachers is that they don't understand how to use the tools And even more important than that is even when they do understand how to use the tools themselves, there is then a big gap between understanding how to use the tool and understanding how to incorporate the use of the tool into the teaching and learning practice that goes on in ordinary primary and secondary education. And this is exemplified by the image you can see here, which some of you may be familiar with. That is the TPAC framework, or what's called a technological pedagogical content knowledge, in that many teachers at the primary and secondary school level may have very good content knowledge. They may have very good pedagogical knowledge. They may even have very good technological knowledge. But fitting these three sources of knowledge together in a way that can allow for successful integration of computers and technology into their actual teaching practice is still quite limited. And particularly when it comes to corporate and DDL, teachers generally report very positive experiences using Corpora in teacher training workshops, but then they are still left with very little idea about how to use this in their own classroom. Work is needed on integration. Integration is a term for any kind of technological development or tool or advancement for computer-assisted language learning. In that, very often the training provided is not formal. Maybe in your own teacher training context, you might not have actually ever received training on computer-assisted or technology in the classroom. So you will learn maybe by Googling it, by going on YouTube, this more kind of informal teacher training for integrating teaching technologies into your classroom practice. And it's the same with DDL and Corpora as well. There's a lot to learn, and there's a lack of information about how teachers have tried to integrate that technology into lesson planning and teaching activities and materials development. As you can see here, the quote from Hutchinson is pretty typical of that. There's so much to learn. I'd like to see some lesson plans that teachers have used to integrate the technology. Trying to learn the technology is hard enough. Now I have to create new lesson plans. Okay. So this is where we don't want to be, but this is where the current situation is. Plus, I already mentioned that most DDL studies are mainly focused on Western, white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies, which is reflective of a so-called digital divide between countries that have access to a lot of information and communications technologies within classroom practice and those that don't. And one of the things that I've experienced a lot in working with Indonesian teacher trainees so far in the last couple of years is especially the big gap even within one country. For example, Indonesia, where those working in major cities generally have quite well resourced and have access to broadband internet, and some schools may even allow the use of devices into the classroom. Whereas if you head out into the more rural areas, internet access may be very limited. The computer may be owned only by the teacher. And that may be the teacher's own personal computer, as the school may not have one. Students may not bring in devices into the classroom, or they literally don't have any of their own. So even within one context like Indonesia, it is not very straightforward to be able to integrate computer-assisted language learning into classroom practice in many classrooms. So that kind of brings me to the end of the first part of the talk. I've kind of set the story so far in terms of the basics of what corpus consultation is from a theoretical point of view. And I've talked about the problems so far of integrating corporate and DDL into classroom practice, touching a little bit there on the Indonesian situation. Let's open it up for just a couple of minutes and we'll take some reactions around the room, and feel free to unmute your microphone perhaps and to get into the chat here. But I'm just trying to read the room a little bit. Of the people here in the room, how much do you know about Corpora? How much do you know about DDL? Is this something that you know about and would like to try? Is it something that you never heard of before? What do you think? Just have a think about that for a moment. And maybe we could do, I'm not able to do a poll, I don't think, but maybe if the host could organize one, perhaps. No, I don't think I have the ability to do that here, but that's okay. So I'm going to assume that overall people's knowledge of Corpora and DDL is, you probably heard of it a little bit. You may have some interest, and maybe that's why you're here today to attend the talk, because it's something that you have heard of and it's something that you want to find out more about. Some of you are coming in the chat now to say it's a totally new concept, but don't know where to start. So in my experience so far, giving these kind of workshops and talks, that's about where we're at. It's either a totally new concept, or they've heard of it and have tried a corpus, using a corpus for their own language learning, but don't necessarily know how to go about integrating it into their classroom practice. So with that in mind, it might be a good idea then. Okay, I've just got another message here. Again, I know a little bit, never used the tool. I've learned about it, learned Corpora years ago. I've only just discovered data-driven learning. And again, these are pretty typical of the reactions that I've gotten so far when demonstrating Corpora and DDL as a concept to audiences in the Indonesian context. So let's give you a little bit of a flavor then about what some of the tools are that I might typically use with language learners for DDL. And bear in mind that there should be specific uses that deal with specific issues. And it is not the idea that you suddenly convert all of your lessons and lesson planning into focusing on corpus use, because it's just too much. But there are specific areas within your lesson plans where getting your students to use a corpus to answer some questions about language that they might have would be a really good interactive activity that allows for a little bit of mediation with the technology and can bring a quite boring lesson on vocabulary or grammar, or even a boring activity on phraseology or collocation, and can really bring them to life. Let's have a quick look at some of the typical packages that I might use, and I'll just copy the links to these in the chat, and I will also send the PowerPoint slides to the organizer at the end of the talk so that they might be able to send them out to everybody who has registered for today. The first is the Scale platform, and this is called the Sketch Engine for Language Learning. It's one of the most popular, freely available, open, accessible corpus resources that are out there. And we mentioned before about the use of the term quick car, fast car, for example. So why don't I try searching for examples of quick within the corpus. And what this will do is it will give me some concordance lines of whole sentences which are taken from a very large collection of about 1 billion words of data that is stored online. And by searching for the term quick, I can see that it occurs a certain number of times per million words. There's some information here, if you click, about where that comes from and what it is, how to read a concordance, and about the technology behind it, which I'll let you read in your own times. But the idea here is that if I'm a language teacher and I want to teach my students about the use of the word quick, I would get them to enter the term quick into Skell. And then right here, I've got some examples of the use of the term in context. And it gives me 40 of these by default. I could also get some variations of the lemma quick, including quicker and quickest, and so on. And then if I compare that with fast, for example, I can see here that the term fast, again, occurs a certain number of hits per million. And I've got fasting, fast, and lots of different examples of that word there in context that I might use maybe as a language teacher to develop some multiple choice quizzes, some closed tests, and so on. And to get students to understand the words that come before fast. For example, something is changing fast. Or words that can come together with fast to make new words, for example, fast food. Or at the larger level, the use of phraseology, phrases including the word fast, for example here, the fastest growing marketing techniques. Fast weight loss. Something is selling fast. The skunk was fast asleep, and so on. Skell also allows for the use of a word sketch. A word sketch uses the corpus data to provide you with lots of information about the word fast and the words that occur around the word fast, so that you can look at a glance at, for example, nouns modified by fast, maybe fast paced, fast bowler, fast food restaurants, fast bowling, so on. Modifiers of fast, something might be incredibly fast, much fast, extremely fast, amazingly fast, and so on. Words that come in all constructions, for example, hard or fast, easier and fast, cheaper and fast, slow and fast. And getting this information then about the word and the words that can come around it. Another thing that Corpora are very good at is looking at phrases, something that online dictionaries generally only allow you to search for one single word. It's much harder for online dictionaries to provide examples and information about multi-word units. So I've got here fast car. And now I've got examples about fast car and so on. And also then, if I compare fast car to quick car, if I remember here that I've got some information about the frequency of fast car, and I type in quick car, you now see that the frequency of quick car is much, much less than that of fast car. And I don't even get 40 examples here from the corpus data. So it shows me that, yes, quick car can be used, but very rarely. most of the time people are using fast car. So that tells me something that I need to know. And that there is a little bit about Skell. Another tool which is similar to Skell is that of Lingle, produced by colleagues in Taiwan. And what Lingle does is it allows you to compare some different phrases. For example, here I'm going to use quick, fast, car. So the two words here separated by /. And then that gives me some information about which term is the more frequent in the corpus data. And I can see here that quick car does appear. That's not to say that quick car is the wrong answer, but that 83.1% of the time, fast car is the one that I might be looking for. And I can click on these results and again be presented with information, sentences about that expression. Similarly, if I want to check whether a word is used or not, I've got an example here. Discuss about the situation. Here with the question mark is going to check whether I need the word about or not. And I can see here that discuss about the situation is very, very rare, and it's discuss the situation that I want to use. So this is a good way for students to check their writing, check if they need that word in that phrase or not. And then again, I can click on that and get some information about how that works. So that is Lingle. Some other options are provided here in the help, and you can have a play around with that in your own time. When you start to get into the more powerful tools for more specific purposes, for example, here, the use of the full sketch engine platform, and this is the free Corpora that are available here, which I'm just going to type into the chat. These allow you to consult corpus data of different kinds and of different languages as well. And in the paid version of Sketch Engine, there are Indonesian corpora that are available for consultation, which is something that is pretty useful. A lot of my work has been done on the British Academic Written English corpus, which I'm just going to have a look at here. And this allows me to search for words, but this time the corpus data is composed of academic texts written by university students and their professors at different levels of proficiency. So unlike Skell and Lingle, which are more general corpora, which look at general language, here I can look at very specific areas of language. For example, here I'm going to put in chemical, but this time I'm interested in looking at only text from maybe chemistry. And I'm just going to press search. And then I know here that I'm getting these concordance results about the use of the term chemical from a data set that is academic English only. And I can use some of those similar functions. For example, I can view as sentences. I can organize these by their complexity, so as to put the simpler sentences first, which might make it a bit easier to language learners. I can look at the frequency of the term or its collocates. These are the words that come before or after the use of chemical in my data. So I can see that corrosive chemical, toxic chemical, chemical shifts, chemical hydrolysis, chemical reactions are all words that occur around the use of this term chemical in academic writing. So some of these corpus platforms are incredibly powerful and will allow you to do very specific searches in very specific data sets, which might be of use to your students if you're studying something very specific. For example, high school chemistry, high school biology, high school physics, and so on. You may want to expose your students to disciplinary corpora. Another super useful tool for those of you working or wanting to use your own texts to get your students working with your own text using DDL is that of VersaText, which is a tool made by my colleague James Thomas and Dr. Vit Beiser, who also helped make Skell as well. And what this does is it allows you to copy and paste in your own text or use some of the texts that are here, for example, the hitchhiker. So I've just clicked this and I've got here some text that is taken from a graded reader, but it's perfectly fine for you to copy your own text into there. So for example, I might here take out something that I'm working on right now, which is a book chapter, incidentally, about data-driven learning and when it goes wrong, which I suppose is rather ironic. I've got my text there. I'm going to copy that into VersaText. And now that that text is in there, I can take a look at a word cloud that shows me the most frequent words within that text, and I can limit this according to part of speech. For example, if I'm interested in only the nouns, then I can reveal that, no problem. And then I can click on any of these and it will take me to the concordances from my text. So here I've used the word teachers 14 times so far in that chapter. And these are examples of the concordances that use the word teachers. So I've got here learners and teachers, secondary school teachers, teachers and learners, from the teacher's perspective, and so on. 2 cohorts of teachers. Not only that, I can have a look at the profile of that text, which lets me look at the vocabulary in terms of the simpler vocabulary, which are vocabulary that appear in the top 1,000 vocabulary lists. This separated up into noun and verb and adjective and so on. The more complex vocabulary that appears less frequently, but may be useful for more advanced level learners. Academic words that appear in the academic word list. And the text-specific words that are really what my chapter is really about. And these are the words that I might expect learners to really have to study if they want to understand what a particular text or data set is about. So those are kind of 4 tools there that I tend to demonstrate to potential language learners and teachers when I'm introducing DDL. And I've got one more tool to show you at the end of the session today, that I'm developed by myself that does a lot of things that you might want to see in a tool that is developed specifically for secondary school learners and perhaps lower level English users at the university level. So do look out for that. Okay. So what I think I might do there, because I've spoken for an hour, I might just give us about 5 minutes break here and just to have a little play with some of the tools that I've shared in the chat there. So Scale, Lingual, Sketch Engine, and Versatext. Just have a quick play with those for the next kind of 5 minutes. And then when I get back, because I just need to get some water and just have a little break for a moment, I will then just ask you how you got on with that. When that's done, then we're going to have a look at how some language teacher trainees in Indonesia tried to integrate those tools into their lesson planning. We'll see how that went. But I'm just going to take a quick break here and disappear for 5 minutes. And then in the meantime, while I'm gone, you have a quick look at those tools, okay? All right, check it out. I'll be right back, everyone.
Sure, Dr. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Dr. Peter. And Pak Ibu can try to access the software and also have some, keyword searches there so that you can practice by yourself, on how to use Corpus for language teaching and learning. Or maybe if you have any questions, you can also type the question in the chat box. Okay, some of the participants have tried the websites and they find it great. Yeah, okay, so that's perfect. Yeah. Most of the websites are free. I think Dr. Peter Crosswaite has mentioned that the softwares or the websites are free, except for Sketch Engine, it has the paid version. Yeah, but what is shown here today is the free version. Okay.
Check. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks for allowing me to have the little break there. And I've seen some questions in the chat. And again, because I'm not able to monitor the chat in real time as I do the talk, if you want to save those questions for the end of the session, and there'll be plenty of time to get through those questions. And hopefully I answer some of these questions with the rest of my talk with relation to how best to implement some of this stuff into the classroom practice. So I guess at this point, it's kind of a critique, I think, of the field, I suppose, that many DDL training workshops or seminars will just stop here, in that I show you the tools and I go, oh, great, now you've got these wonderful tools. All of your problems are solved. Now go away and become DDL experts and everybody's happy, right? But we know from now years of experience that just showing the tools is not enough. There has to be that extra push to bridge the gap between understanding the technical knowledge about the tools and then the pedagogical knowledge of how can I integrate these tools into my teaching and learning practice, into my assessments, into my curriculum, and so on. So that's the next part. And I'm going to present, as I said, some information from a study which was published in 2 different papers relating to my attempts to show Indonesian language teacher trainees how to use DDL tools within their lesson planning practice. And the Indonesian context, like many other contexts in the region, have a huge interest in English language teaching, and many thousands of people taking English language teacher training courses at Indonesian universities. It's a huge area of growth around Southeast Asia and Asia more generally. However, it's probably fair to say that instruction and training on computer-assisted language learning within teacher training courses in the region is lacking. There is not much instruction on incorporating technology into teacher training. Much of the teacher training is about teaching grammar and vocabulary, and maybe about some modern teaching practices, for example, task-based language learning and teaching, and so on, but not much about how to integrate technology into classroom practice. And I presented some data that, obviously, I already mentioned that a lot of regions, particularly in rural areas, kind of suffer from poor internet, and there's not much software available in the Indonesian language either. A lot of it is taken from other countries, so that can cause trouble. And then access to computers and high-speed internet is not great in many parts of the country. So to set the scene, obviously, what I wanted to do was to create a project whereby we could try to introduce corporate and DDL to language teacher trainees in the hope that we might be able to gain more interest in what we were doing with these language teacher trainees, and eventually to hope that these trainees would go on to use Corpora and DDL in their real teaching practice when they graduated. However, we couldn't have timed it worse, because just as I was about to get on the airplane to go to Jakarta and begin these training sessions, I think we all know what happened towards the beginning of 2020, when we were faced with the global COVID-19 pandemic, which eliminated all travel to and from Australia for the next 2 years. Therefore, everything had to be moved online, and we had to make use of Zoom workshops like this one, Google Classroom, and online resources to do the training. But we still felt that it was the right thing to go ahead and to give this a try, despite the difficulties that everybody was having at the time. The research questions for the project were as follows, and I'll just let you read these. But really, we were interested in understanding how, after some initial training in Corpora and DDL, how would new language teacher trainees attempt to incorporate Corpora and DDL into their lesson planning? And were they able to do that in a way that demonstrated a good alignment or fit of the teaching goals, the content goals, and the technology, the so-called TPAC that I already mentioned in the first part of this talk? And in terms of the method, as I mentioned, because of COVID, I could not be there in person, so we relied on online resources. In particular, the initial training into Corpora and using Corpora and understanding how they work was provided through a freely available online course that I made for university students here at the University of Queensland, and I've just posted the link to this course in the chat. And anybody can join this course. It's a short private online course about data-driven learning, and it's designed for university level students to understand how to improve their academic writing, focusing on academic vocabulary and grammar. And the course, as I mentioned, is freely available. You don't have to pay any money. All you need is an edX account, which is free. And then you can enroll on the course and be taken to a series of online modules, with each one taking about an hour to complete. And at the end of the 5th module, you can get a certificate for completing the course. The first module deals with dictionaries versus translation websites and Corpora. The second module includes basic corpus functions, including how to search Corpora, understanding how to read and manipulate concordance lines, understanding frequency and collocation information. Module 3 deals with specific corpus queries for vocabulary. Module 4 deals with grammar, and Module 5 deals with disciplinary variation, so differences between, say, arts and humanities subjects versus the sciences, for example. Now, the language teacher trainees took the first 2 modules only, so Module 1 and Module 2. With the idea is that by finishing these modules, they would understand at least the basics of corpus consultation using those 4 tools that I showed you earlier. So the Scale platform, Versatext, Sketch Engine, and Lingual. Now, once they've done that, they were also involved with Google Classroom discussions with their teacher trainer about what to do. These were done in English, but some conversations were also conducted in Indonesian as well. And the learners would get together and discuss their ideas for the training. I then ran 3 workshops. First, focusing on the basics of corpus consultation, the second on building your own corpora and analyzing them, and the third on lesson planning. At the next step, I took lesson plans from the trainees, and these were half the trainees were going to work in primary schools and the other half were going to work in secondary schools. And what I did was I looked at their lesson plans and I made notes on their lesson plans about how and where a corpus activity could help to improve the lesson plan, to make it more interactive, to increase the interaction with technology and so on. So here are some examples. I've got one here where the students are going to look at a hortatory text, which is like an argumentative text. These were the objectives. These were, for example, to understand the generic structure of a text, understand social functions and language features of that kind of text, write their own text using correct structure and grammatical patterns, and so on. And you can see here my advice was how they could use Corpora here to make these lesson objectives more interactive and more meaningful through corpus consultation. As another example, lesson objective might be something like this at the primary school level. Here too, students should be able to identify the use of the simple past tense and recognize the difference between regular verbs and irregular verbs. And I've mentioned here that a corpus would lend itself very well to this kind of objective. Or here, the teacher has posted some vocabulary that students are supposed to explore when dealing with a topic. And I've mentioned here that a corpus could be used to explore this vocabulary in context. Within the teacher's lesson plans, when it came to explaining grammar, one of the things that they did was to copy and paste kind of teaching materials from the internet. And in their lesson plan, they would basically just read this out to their students, word for word almost, writing everything down on the whiteboard or the blackboard, whatever they had. And that would probably be quite a boring lesson for their students, and whether it would lead to acquisition of this difference might be very hard to know. So I mentioned here again that you could replace this kind of lengthy description with some corpus activities that might make turning this kind of description of the grammar into something more interactive, get them engaged with the language involved and to get them to come to their own conclusions about the difference between regular verbs and irregular verbs with through access to corpus technology. The next thing we asked them to do then was to design, after all of that training, was to design a new lesson plan, and it should contain at least one corpus activity somewhere within that lesson plan. And they all did this, except that the primary school teachers did not do it. And I'll come on to that in a moment about why. But all of the secondary school teachers did submit a lesson plan that contained at least one corpus activity. We analyzed those lesson plans for TPAC, namely, did the lesson plan show good alignment between curriculum goals and technologies, the instructional strategies and technologies, the selection of the technology, and the fit between the content, pedagogy, and the technology together, with 4 being the highest and 1 being the lowest. Now, I know this is probably going to be a bit small for you, but I will send you the slides after the talk. But you can see here, this is basically the structure of the lesson plan template on the left. These are examples of non-corpus activities here in the first column. But these are all of the examples of the corpus activities that the language teacher trainees put into their lesson plans here on this column. So if we go through the lesson materials, for example, orientation. The teacher greets the students and leads them in a prayer. Teacher asks the students to point out the action verbs in a text. Students are asked to brainstorm about the pictures that the teacher shows in the screen. So these are activities that don't involve corpus. But if we go over here, teacher checks SCEL for whether the true word is containing or contains. Teacher uses Versatext to find keywords of sample text to answer the comprehension question. Students use Sketch Engine to complete a quiz on quizzes. Students use SCEL to look for contexts that use present tense and action verbs. Teacher tells students if they are confused about the use of some words, they are encouraged to use SCEL. And even in terms of the basic competencies and lesson objectives, some of the trainees were able to modify these to include corpus consultation, which is really quite good. Overall, the trainees scored pretty highly for the integration of curriculum goals and technologies and the integration of technology selection. But where they did not do so well was on the use of instructional strategies and technologies. So understanding how to teach with Corpora was the bit that they found most difficult. And this is what we found in most of the research to date. However, the fact is that even though they weren't that good at this, they were all able to produce at least one corpus-based activity following very minimal training. So we were still quite pleased with these trainees' performance overall. And it showed what could be possible if the training went on for a little bit longer, and maybe if the training was done face-to-face instead of online only, because as mentioned, the COVID caused a lot of difficulty. I'll now show you some examples of low TPAC lesson planning. So the low TPAC one, I think it's the first one here. Yeah. So this is a sample lesson plan about how to write a descriptive text. And the lesson objectives are here. to determine the social functions, text structure, and linguistic elements about the descriptive text of Lake Toba, which apparently is a big lake somewhere in Indonesia, I think. And in terms of the objectives, only one of the objectives involved corpus consultation, and that's this one here. And they just said to make a simple outline of the text using the corpus and skeleton versa text. But it's not really sure how the teachers and the students were supposed to use the software to make the outline, because the tools are not really designed for that. The tools are not there to help you make an outline of a descriptive text. The tools are there to help you understand the vocabulary and the grammar about the text, but not to help you make a simple outline of a descriptive text. So here you can see the teacher has tried to use the corpora in an activity, but it hasn't really been aligned with the lesson objective properly. So the descriptive text, I think, is provided here. You can see a little bit about the activity structure. Step one, the teacher presents a video about a descriptive text. The teacher gives them a worksheet. They look at the worksheet to understand some of the language. Then here, the teacher will introduce a corpus to find a meaning related to tourist attractions using SKEL. The teacher shows the students about versatile to find the keywords of the text. The teacher shows the students how to find the keywords that lead the students to answer the question, where Komodo Island is located. So the text, I believe, is at the bottom of the sheet. Maybe it's here somewhere. That's it. That's the text. Or was it this one? It was one of these. I can't remember exactly which one it was. But the idea is that the teacher has made some activities that use a corpus, but the use of the corpus would not help students to complete the activity. So that's what we mean by low TPAC. Okay. So I guess the idea kind of worked a little bit. They would put that text into versa text and explore some of the language, but the teachers tried to use the tools in a way that would not help them to achieve their objectives there. So that was a bit of an issue. Then we look at a medium TPAC lesson plan. This one's a little bit better. Here, in terms of the objectives, the lesson plan calls to analyze the language focus of the text through corpus tools, which is pretty useful. And then we get a step-by-step lesson plan, which includes different activities involving the corpora, and it would be activities that students could use the corpus to actually complete. So I believe that lesson plan is this one, maybe? Yeah, it's this one. And it's about, they're doing spoken and written report texts here. So teaching about report text. And they're going to watch a video. Well, let's scroll down here to the activities. And this is what we get in terms of the lesson plan structure. So remember, the objective is about report text and understanding report text. And they're going to use a corpus to look at some of the language contained within those texts. Step one, the teacher greets the students, they pray together, they do the attendance list, and the teacher shows a video about tigers to the students. Teacher asks the students to mention the most interesting thing about the video and the most interesting thing about technology development, and so on. Teacher asks the students if they have a desire to be a scientist, and so on. So we're getting that kind of discussion about the topic and about some of the language. Then we get into a report text, which is this one here, about mobile phones. Okay? Just a basic thing that they got from the internet somewhere. But now we have a look at how that text and the vocabulary in that text can then lend itself to a corpus-based activity. So here we go. They start by showing the students the report text. Students are asked to read and pay attention to the text. Teacher asks the students to mention the function of the text, point out some of the action verbs. Teacher asks the students questions about some of the grammatical features of the text, categorize the text structure, and give them a mini exercise questions about their understanding. Next, here is where the teacher then integrates the use of the Skell platform into that activity. So after all of that initial work, the teacher then shows the students how to use Skell. Students are asked to work in pairs and open Skell. They are asked to highlight the present tense and action verbs in that report text and then use Skell to look for contexts that use present tense and action verbs. Teacher shows the students the present tense and action verbs usage for other contexts in the Skell corpus. Then, as a consolidation activity, teacher gives the students mini exercise questions to make sure the students' understanding of present tense and action verbs. Then, at the writing stage, teacher asks the students to produce a report text paragraph individually and have them use the Skell corpus to check their grammar. So you see here, this lesson plan has successfully integrated a corpus activity to help students understand the vocabulary and the grammar of this reading text that the students have been given. And as a consolidation activity, students are also asked to use the Corpora in rewriting their own short report text. So this is a really good way of incorporating or integrating that corpus technology into a standard lesson, which is a really good example. In terms of the high TPAT lesson plan then, so this is the best fit of the corpus technology into the lesson plan. Here, the purpose of this lesson plan is to understand an analytical text. And the corpus use has actually been embedded into the basic competencies and the lesson objectives, as you can see here. In order to demonstrate that students have acquired the ability to understand analytical texts, students are able to distinguish the social functions, text structures, and language elements by searching for language features in the BAWE corpus, which I showed you in the first part of this talk. Again, check the language features through the BAWE, and by embedding this corpus activity into the assessment plan, you're getting that integration of the corpus platform into what you're doing. Same here with the objective. Lesson objectives. Students can understand the content of the text by checking the new words in the corpus, and so on. So in terms of the plan here, there is a reading text called Procrastination is Not Bad. The teacher asks the students some questions about the language contained in the text. This is the text here. It's a pretty long one. They then, after reading that text and playing with it for a bit, the students then have a look at a corpus to look at linking adverbials which are present within that text. But most importantly, the way that this is done is to use an online quiz, which I hope is still there. It's probably been deleted by now. Yeah, it's gone. Yeah, I think they don't keep the quizzes on there forever. But what the student actually did was they made a quiz online and they had to use the corpus to answer the questions. So the example here, you can see, search the two words in each number using the BAWE corpus. So for example, here we've got other than versus however. So should it be other than or however here in the slot? Doing something over and over again, you should try a new approach. So maybe we could look at that, you know, if we go into scale, we could have other than. So the students look at whether that kind of construction would work. Other than doing something. Okay, so we see that that one isn't that popular in this particular corpus. I think it must be in the BAWE corpus. So that's the one that I showed you just before, which I'll just bring up again here. Other than doing something. See, and now it's not coming up. So maybe it's the other word. But what's important here is that by embedding the corpus consultation within the quiz and embedding that within the complete lesson plan, the lesson plan itself demonstrates a language-focused, teacher-scaffolded set of corpus activities that seamlessly incorporate DDL technology and pedagogy to achieve the stated lesson objectives. So this lesson plan is a kind of really excellent example about how a language teacher can incorporate a corpus-based activity into a complete language lesson. So, but also as I hope that you can see, it's not about building a complete lesson around the corpus technology and changing everything that you're doing. But it's about, okay, I've got this lesson plan on this target genre that I'm trying to teach my students. How can I take a corpus activity and make that lesson more interactive, more engaging, and more technologically focused? And I hope that you can see here, by embedding the corpus activity in this way, that this teacher training has done a really good job of doing that by putting it within a complete lesson plan. So at the end of all that, we asked the teacher trainees what they thought. Overall, they felt that the corpus training was very good, very positive. They felt that they would use the Corpora on their own. They felt that the Corpora was helpful for learning grammar, helpful for learning vocabulary, better than dictionaries and translation websites, and so on. The language teacher trainees also felt that the training was enough for them within about, say, 5 to 6 hours of work online, and then plus the lesson planning and the workshops as well. So probably a total of about 10 hours. That time was mostly sufficient for them to develop some degree of corpus literacy, so that they could use the Corpora on their own. However, when we look at future classroom use, a lot of the learners felt that they might not be able to integrate corpus technology into their classroom practice, particularly with younger learners. And what we saw in the data was a split between the primary school teachers who really felt that this approach was not for them. And this is mostly because the primary school trainees didn't understand how to use Corpora themselves, so they felt if they couldn't do it, their learners would definitely not be able to do it, which is a fair enough comment. But they also struggled to think about how and where they might incorporate the corpus activity into their lesson practice. And this is because of the way that primary school students are taught language in a lot of these second language classrooms, in that they don't use much technology. A lot of it is reading, listening and repeating, songs, games, and so on. So they felt that introducing Corpora into the lessons here would be something that may not be necessary exactly. And it's probably fair enough. We don't recommend that you try to force corpus use into a context where it doesn't really have a place or a purpose, because then that's just going to make everybody hate the whole activity and hate the whole idea, which is fine. But all of the secondary school teachers, however, these are the ones giving mostly the agreed opinions here. The secondary school teachers all felt that using Corpora could be super useful for them in their future classroom use, but they just need that little bit of extra help understanding how to integrate that into their lesson planning. Some of the Indonesia-specific concerns raised include a lack of technology, not allowing students to use mobile phones or something like that, a kind of lack of trust in their students to use Corpora over translating things. School regulations, having to provide computers and the internet for all students. Issues with perhaps older, more senior teachers who've been teaching for many years and who wouldn't feel comfortable trying something new. And the fact that teachers around the world, and I've not just found this in Indonesia, but around the world, in Hong Kong, South Korea, China, in all the different places that I've worked, is that if teachers are busy, they may not have time to incorporate something new if it's not directly focused on their high school tests or the curriculum. So again, that is something that will continue to be a stumbling block in incorporating Corpora into the classroom practice. So to conclude that point, the Indonesian teacher trainees generally saw the benefits of Corpora. They responded well to the training. Getting help with their lesson planning practice was considered as really useful for helping them understand how and where to fit corpus technology into their lesson planning. We did get that primary versus secondary school trainees split, but again, that's fine. I'm not too worried about that. And if we can overcome some of the other issues, such as the alignment of the corpus activities with the curriculum and with the assessments in particular, we might get a lot more buy-in then from language teacher training. So that leads me to just a kind of, again, another short break here. If you just take a couple of minutes just to think about what are some of the ways that you might overcome some of the issues that I just raised that were faced by those language teacher trainees in that in the Jakarta Teacher Training Institute. And maybe just think to yourself about how you might be able to incorporate Corpora or DDL into your lesson planning or assessments or curricula in a way that is going to avoid some of those issues, such as a lack of resources, a lack of time, a lack of alignment with curriculum goals or high school examination. But before you do that, I'm just going to open up the final part of my talk now with a demonstration of some open resources for DDL lesson planning that I think you might find very useful. And we are beginning to see and develop a lot more in the way of open educational resources, which are like textbooks, but they're freely available online, and that we're starting to get quite a few of these now that contain lesson plans for data-driven learning. And I myself, together with partners in Brazil, have been working on a new suite of materials, which I'm going to show you in a moment. So I already mentioned my online course, Improving Writing Through Corpora. Again, I hope that should you feel that you've got a bit of time for some training, that you might want to sign up for that course. And again, it's freely available. And I don't expect that you'll go through and complete every single module or activity. But at the very least, if you take module 1 and 2, I think you will have mastered the basics of what it is that we're trying to promote there. And then I'll move on to another resource that has become recently available through a colleague of mine called Ellen Lefol, who's now at a major university in Europe. And she has developed a set of ready-made lesson plans for use at both primary, secondary, tertiary, and professional contexts. And that's here the Creating Corpus-Informed Materials for the English as a Foreign Language Classroom project, which is touted as being a step-by-step guide for trainee teachers. And you can see here some ready-made lesson plans for primary and lower secondary school, upper secondary school, some CLIL or Content and Language Integrated Learning lessons at secondary school, and some vocational education, depending on who you're working with. So one here, for example, teaching geography in English, how to describe a graph is a good example. We are given an introduction and rationale for the lesson. We are given some outline and objectives, which you can see here. The lesson is designed to be taught within a bilingual geography classroom of 10th graders at a German secondary school. Bilingual teaching combines foreign language acquisition with specific subjects to acquire a more profound language proficiency. In the lesson, students learn about the demographic transition model. And I don't know what that is. It's something in geography, I imagine. They do this by reading text and drawing a graph. And they learn how to describe a graph by querying the corpus to advance their language skills. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to understand and use appropriate words and collocations to describe a graph, to use some basic functions in Sketch Engine and differentiate between these functions and know how to use them. You then get a step-by-step lesson guide explaining the warm-up, the main lesson, the detailed instructions, including descriptions of all the tasks as follows, and some information on the tasks themselves, which for some reason I managed to select the one that doesn't work, but you get the basic idea. And there are lots of others here, for example, upper secondary school, Maybe here, differences in the grammatical structures of tell and say. So again, using the corpus to learn the difference between tell and say. And this is something that even my own son gets wrong all the time. He always said, tell me a question, or I'm going to tell her, when he means to say ask, right? He gets the verb confused. And the idea here is that common errors such as she told to me, or my teacher said me that, instead of she said to me, or my teacher told me that, can be used can be made more salient through the use of corpus consultation. Using this case, the BNC corpus tool, which is shown here, which I'm not going to go into today, because I tend not to use this tool as a DDL resource, but I posted the link into the chat for anyone who might be interested in that. So those are Leffol's activities, but got here just as a kind of last example now of activities that I am developing, again, with partners in Brazil, that are giving us ready-made lesson plans that are suitable for language teachers around the world. And these are not finished yet, so we're still working on revising them and making sure that all of the activities work properly. But most importantly, the difference between our resources and those of Leffol's is that we provide two forms of the lesson. Namely, we provide the so-called hands-on version of the lesson and the hands-off version of the lesson. And I already mentioned at the beginning of the talk that hands-on means that the students are going to access the internet to look at corpus data, which means they need the internet and they need their own device. But we've also provided a version of the lesson that is hands-off, where as long as the teacher has access to the internet and they can print or demonstrate some concordances on a projector, for example, that they could still do the DDL activity even if the students are not able to actually consult the corpus themselves. So one here, for example, about adverbs of frequency. Each of the lesson plans here contain a description of the lesson. In this case, about adverbs of frequency and frequency expressions, focusing on the use of always, sometimes, never, usually, frequently, and rarely. There is a video which explains how to use the tool to look at those adverbs. Just a short video, which I'm just going to play this one for you. I hope this comes across on Zoom.
We will understand how to discover possible uses of frequency verbs.
And don't worry if you can't hear this now, you can go and check it out in your own time. Just to give you an overview of what each lesson contains.
The verb always. So first, we're going to open the scale and type the adverb, okay, like I have just done. The tool is going to show us the first results, okay, and going to show us this in concordance line, as you can see. And if we scroll down the screen, we can see different examples, okay, of this. If you go to example 24, like I'm highlighting here, you can see he was always doing little projects. Okay, so showing us how people really use that verb in real life. to these tools, we can have different examples, and Scale provides us more tools besides those examples. Okay, for example, if you click here in the word cat, we're going to see some combinations, okay, of the word that we search, that is the perfect verb always, with some verbs like have, be, want, okay. In this case here, these verbs, they are modified by always. You can use this tool with any words that you want, just click here and
okay. So you get the point in that there's a little video demonstration. We then get some information about the lesson plan, which can just be printed by the teacher so that they don't need to read through the full description. They then get the full teacher instructions in terms of lesson development, including an introduction, test of prior knowledge, lesson development using the corpus for the full time, applying the corpus to some practical purpose, in this case, using them in sentences, some kind of discussion or conclusion, and some form of assessment. Then we get the actual lesson activities, which are described here. Students can enter their answers into the boxes and check their responses. For example, here, which sentences can you write with the following adverbs of frequency? Go to Scale and look for potential uses of these adverbs and write some examples below. Write some other sentences that include all uses of these adverbs that you found on Scale. And again, we're still revising these, and they're going to be more consolidation activities and some restructuring to the book. But that was the hands-on activities. If you look here at the hands-off activities, you can see that you don't need to use the corpus here because some examples have been provided for you. So as long as the teacher can show this on their computer or even print this at home and bring it into class, that the students can still do the activity. Okay. So one last thing then to show you, which I'd just like to share because this is something that is brand new and that is developed by myself, and that is the CorpusMate platform, which is specifically designed for use with younger secondary school learners. Now, this link will not be available forever because it will change to a new link in the future once the platform is finally complete. But what you can do here is many of the things that you might want to do with, say, with Lingle or with one of the other tools. But this time you can filter by high school topic, of which there are 20 different topics, spanning science, history, technology, education, and so on. And you can look at the results in a pattern, and it provides you with the most frequent 4-word combination from that data set without having to search through lots of different functions or press lots of different buttons. You get the most frequent phraseology straight away from any search. When you click on the word, you can find some information about what kind of text that word came from, what the topic was, and so on. Then you can filter your search according to the topic. So if, for example, if I want to just look at its use in history, I can go ahead and it will now give me some other examples. For example, to assess the role of the people in politics, to assess the role of religion, and so on. I can use wildcard searches. Sorry, it's because I hit the full stop there. And using the compare results function, I can then see what the most frequent word is going to be after assess. And I can also have a look at the distribution of that term in terms of the different subject areas. So for example, here, I can see that that word is used quite frequently in history as compared with geography, mathematics, and so on. And I can see which corpus that information came from. So this is still far from finished. This is only a developmental version. We're going to put in information here about the difference between spoken and writing. We're going to have a lot more spoken corpora in here. The visualizations are going to be improved, but I hope that this is something that you can have a quick play with, maybe at the end of the talk, so that you can see some of the different functions of this very easy to use and freely available tool that you might want to incorporate in some of your teaching and learning practice, whatever it is that you decide to do. So we've been going now for a couple of hours. I'm guessing that we're pretty much done here. And I'd like to finish then by opening things up for discussion. So going back to some of those questions that we had in the chat and leaving it open for the people here in attendance to talk about how and should DDL be conducted in your context, teaching and learning in Indonesia. So let's have a think about this.
Okay. Thank you, Peter, for the wonderful presentation. Let me help you check the message. We have some messages or some questions from the participants. The first one is from Asi Zunaida. So she told us that it is totally a new concept, but she is not sure of where to start her research or practice using DDL in classes. Maybe
I saw some
practical
of these
tips.
Yeah, I saw some of these comments like because they came like after the first hour. So in terms of the actual questions, I think we had well, hopefully.
Oh yeah, we have from.
Yeah. Let me just go back to yeah, sorry.
Maybe from Ibu Intan Pradita. So.
Yeah, I got that. So some
yeah.
EFL students often misuse English lexical qualifications. How can we adopt DDL for EFL writing assessment? So obviously, one of the things that you can do is you can straight away go to that lesson that we had from our textbook here. And some of these, like for example here about adverbs of frequency, or here studying computer collocation using SCELP, we've got here some ready-made activities that will allow you to look at how to incorporate lessons on collocation. And we've already provided a number of ideas or lesson plans that will allow you to do that. So if you've got a lesson on that you want to explore collocation, something you might want to do is to get your students to think of some collocations on their own. Have a look at the collocations that are correct and incorrect. Get the students to use a corpus to explore some of the incorrect collocations and to understand why some of these collocations might not be very frequent in the corpus and what this might tell you about whether they are appropriate or not. And then to get the students to use the corpus to explore the appropriacy of other collocations, and then to explore whether these collocations are more common in, say, spoken or written data, whether these collocations are more or less frequent in the sciences versus the arts subjects, and so on. There are so many things that you can do with corpora to explore collocations, and corpora themselves are one of the best ways about learning about collocations, because collocations are so tricky, because there's no kind of rule to teach you which words go together with other words. The association with collocations is a statistically driven process based on what native speakers use. And corpora are the best way to figure that out at the touch of a button without trying to learn kind of complex rules about which collocates go together with other ones. So do try that out.
Okay, thank you. I also have another question from Ani Susanti. Bu Ani Susanti, but this one is maybe not quite clear. Maybe this is part one of the tools that you have explained. How do we identify the quality of the sentence? Maybe Bu Ani Susanti can talk directly here.
Oh yeah, how can we identify the quality of the sentence, formal language or informal? Okay, so here's a really good one, right? This is something that we looked at with relation. We looked at it in this talks with relation to specific corpora, right? So this one here that you could see was the sketch engine platform that contained the British academic written English corpus, right? So the idea here is that if I'm looking in this corpus, that this would be so-called formal academic language, right? So if I search for something in here, I can be sure that I am getting examples of a term that are in so-called formal language, because this corpus data is comprised of all academic writing. It's all formally written. Whereas if I go to SCEL, which is composed of a general corpus, so not necessarily academic writing, but there's speaking in here, there's all kinds of different language data, and I type in the same word, then I'm going to get some examples here that are probably from a mixture of formal and informal context. So that's one way that you can do it, is to look at a general corpus, which may contain more informal language features or more spoken language features, versus an academic corpus, which you know is going to be much more likely to contain formal language. Okay, so that answers your question. Depends on the kind of corpus data that you're using.
Okay, thank you. Now I also have another question, or maybe this is an opinion, from Zulalina. So yeah, so she is now studying gender.
Yep. Okay, gender. This one is great. This is a tool that I didn't show you, but they have a tool now by Lancaster University, which I've just forgotten the name of.
Landsbox, maybe?
No, it's Corpora Lanx. Lanxbox is a different thing.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Not Lanxbox. Where is it? Sorry. There was just a talk on this by our colleague, because it's a pretty new tool, so it doesn't show up on Google that much. Geez, what's it called now? There is a tool by the people at Lancaster that allow you to query the corpus by gender and by other social variables like age and things like that. For some reason, I'm just drawing a complete blank on the use of, on the actual corpus name. However, if I do go into my YouTube channel and avoid all my children's Pokemon and Roblox videos here, but we do have, it's this video here, I think, by our colleague Gaya BNC Lab.
No one sees it.
With Miro,
That introduces that tool for us. And it's the BNC Lab tool. I'll just post the video into the chat here, and you can actually check out that video by yourself. And actually what I should do, and something that I didn't do, is to actually share the playlist with you of my International Perspectives in Corpora for Language Learning YouTube playlist. And at the moment, there are 27 videos in there by world-leading researchers that cover various aspects of corpora for language learning. So it's a really fantastic resource that contains a lot of fantastic videos, and the one that you're looking for is the one for the link that I just shared by Dana Gablasova. And yes, it's that the BNC LAN by lengths. There we go. So if we Google it, it does actually show up. And then if I type in a word, demand for, I can then query this by gender, I believe, which it's a little bit slow because it's just building up. Well, but there, gender. For any search within this one, if I search into if I click gender, it will show me the usage by males and females by two different time points, 1994 and 2014. So if you can think of a term that you think would lend itself well to gender, for example, if I talk about pregnancy, maybe might be a good idea. And then go into gender on that one. That would then allow me to look at the use of the term pregnancy across men and women speakers using this data set. So again, here you can get some information that the term pregnancy is much more used by women. And then if I click on the chart, I can get examples of female speakers specifically discussing pregnancy in spoken interaction. So that's something that this corpus does, this corpus tool does quite well. Aside from gender, you can also split the results by age, social class, and region of the UK as well. And you can also compare a corpus taken from 1996 versus a corpus taken from 2014, so that you can have a look at which expressions have changed over time and which expressions were more frequent in the past compared to their usage over the last decade or so. So I hope that answers your question there.
Okay, thank you. We have another opinion from Ferry Hidayat about the use of Collins-Copfield grammar.
Yep. And again, Collins-Copfield grammar is made from corpus technology. So it's it's Douglas Byber's work. The most famous corpus linguist in the world, Douglas Byber, made the Collins-Copfield English grammar. So what that is built on corpus technology, and it provides you with that basic output. Now, obviously, you put here about the exhaustive discovery lesson and using DDL, which needs a long process of learning. So I guess the idea is that while that might have been true in the past, these days with the newer tools and newer approaches that we've got, they're going to be better than consulting Collins-Copfield for solving particular issues. So I hope that my talk today has given you some ideas about how that might be possible, Pusat. But yeah, thanks for the observation. So I think that was all the ones from the chat, but did anybody have any questions for the live audience?
Yeah, okay, so for the participants who have any questions, you can also raise your hands. Or maybe you want to share your experience. Oh, we have Asi Zunaida. Okay, Asi.
Thank you. Yes, Peter, I need to ask, well, since I'm very, very new to DDL and I haven't made any research in it, as a newbie, what would you suggest me to do as the first time researcher in this field?
So this is for researching or language teaching?
Research.
Yeah, okay.
What would you suggest for me the first time?
Well, the first thing to do is to come up with a question that you think you might want to research, and then to have a think about what data you might use to answer that research question. And then you can have a think about having a play around with a tool that will allow you to do that. So this is how I kind of got started in corpus linguistics, is that I became a corpus linguist, I suppose, when I started my job at the University of Hong Kong. I was researching academic language because that was my job, a researcher. And I wanted to look at how my students' writing developed over the semester following the training in English for academic purposes. So I built a longitudinal corpus of learner data. So I collected their writings from the same people and made a corpus using a platform called UAM corpus tool, which is pretty old now. There's probably much easier and better corpus builders out there than that. But then I used that, I basically just did that as an experiment, playing around with it and using a corpus tool to look at the changes from the first essay to the final essay. And based on that corpus, I managed to get out 3 papers that were published in high impact journals, including Journal of English for Academic Purposes, System, and IRAL. And really it came from just having fun and trying new things and experimenting with the data and playing around. Now, that was probably some time ago now. So I guess in the year 2022, I would start playing around with some of these freely available online tools like the ones that I've shown you and trying to come up with some questions and seeing how those Corpora can help you answer those questions or not. So for example, there, like the BNC Lab tool, which I just showed, like looking at gender differences, for example, or differences in age. You could look at using Corpora for language teaching, and I've just provided a lot of resources on that. And certainly as a complete newbie, have a play with the online course that I developed, the Improving Writing Through Corpora course. Develop a little bit of practice in understanding what Corpora do and what you can search a corpus for and the kind of information that you can get out of it. And then from that, hopefully you'll find some inspiration about what you might want to research. There's also numerous now handbooks available. For example, this one here, the Routledge Handbook of Corpora and English Language Teaching and Learning. There are so many handbooks available now that will give you information or ideas for research topics. And I've also can share with you a kind of draft manuscript of a paper of mine, which explores the most frequent and important research topics in corpus linguistics over the past 20 years. So I'm just going to put that into the chat here. And as well as I also need, before I forget, is to send across to you the PowerPoint slides for today's talk. So there's the paper for the corpus linguistics one. And I'm just sharing the slides now for today's talk as well. So do look out for those in a moment. But yeah, definitely recommend you start there. Can everybody see that file that I just shared in the chat?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. Yeah, take a look at that one. That might give you some ideas for sure.
Okay.
Okay, so here are the slides as well for today. Before I forget, it's this one here. And there you go. So I hope that answers your question. Do we have anybody else?
Thank you, Peter. Very helpful.
No problem at all. Good luck with it.
Any other questions? Any other questions? The audience can raise your hand.
Okay. Well, if not, that's not a problem.
Yeah,
feel free to contact me at any time. I'm also going to post my email address here in the chat. If there's something you'd like to work on in the future, or you have any questions about any of the tools or any of the things I've showed you today, feel free to get in touch or to contact me if you have any other questions.
Or your Twitter account, is it okay to?
Yeah, I have that. I can never remember what it is. I think it's just this maybe with Twitter.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I did see some people posting on Twitter about this talk. So yeah, that's good that, and I think we got 100 participants, which is really good news. And again, just shows the level of interest in this area and corpus linguistics generally, and the enthusiasm for corpora in Indonesia, which is really great to see. And I think that there's going to be much more work done in this region in the next few years.
So you are open for any collaborative work with Indonesians?
100%. And we'd like very much in the post-COVID world to be able to travel and get out there and to see you all in person, as I haven't been able to do that for the last couple of years, but definitely that's something that I have my heart set on in the years to come.
Okay, I think if we don't have any other questions, so this is the end of the talk for today. Thank you for the audience or participants who have joined this guest lecture. Thank you for participating, giving opinions, asking questions. I hope you enjoyed this guest lecture, and also for Dr. Peter Crosswaite. Thank you for giving the talk and also for sharing your expertise with us. I hope you enjoyed your time today. And also for everyone, see you again in another or in the next guest lecture series. We will have another corpus guest lecture in the end of November with Paweł Zdarsky. Yeah. Okay, so
yep, I know
that's
Paul.
all.
I know Paul quite well as well. He appeared in my book on EPL for younger learners.
Yeah.
So he's publishing on collocation.
Vocabulary.
Vocabulary, yeah. So do check out his talk. He's also a really good researcher. You're going to get a lot out of it.
Okay, that's all for the talk, and good afternoon, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Back to the Master of Ceremony.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Peter Crosswaite and also Mrs. Igmi for the interesting explanation. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, before we close the agenda, Dr. Ani, as the head of English education, will symbolically hand over a certificate to Dr. Peter Crosswaite, and please, the operator captures the picture for the documentation. Mrs. Ani, time is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the insights, for everything today. I learned a lot. Every time you share the link, I try to use the link, and I try to use I think this is my early learning on how to use corpus in language teaching and language planning and everything. Hopefully in the future we can have more collaborations, especially for if we gather some lecturers and students to have projects for materials development. Maybe we need to consult to you in the future. Thank
Absolutely,
you so much.
100%. It's a lovely certificate. Thanks very much. You can't kind of hand it to me like literally, but I'll take a screenshot of it. So I'll put it up on Twitter later. So thanks very much, and yeah, hope to see you in person, hopefully in the very near future. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to head off now.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Ani, for closing remarks, and also Dr. Peter Crosswaite and also Mrs. Igmi. So before we end this event, I want to take the documentation for all of the audience here. Please open the camera and we can take a screenshot for the documentation. Okay?
What a good idea.
Yes. Okay, are you ready, everyone? I will count.
Looking good, everyone.
Okay, I will count 1, 2, 3. Smile. Don't forget to smile. Okay. Is it enough, operator?
I think it looks good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the operator, and ladies and gentlemen, I am Aisyah Hril Surya, representing all of the committees. I would like to say thank you so much for your participation, and let's close our event today by reciting Hamdalah together. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you in the next time.
See you. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Everyone, all the best.
Thank you.
Bye bye.